The livestock truck ground its gears and vanished down the mountain road, leaving behind a creature that simply didn't belong. Lucien stared through the driving sleet at 18 hands of scarred, muscle-bound draft horse. It wasn't the agile cow pony he'd bought. It was a giant. And Lucien was out of time. The sleet was coming down in sharp, lateral sheets by the time Lucien Pendleton managed to get the barn doors closed. He leaned his weight against the rotting wood, shoving the iron latch into place, and then turned to look at his ruin. It was standing in the center aisle of the barn, dripping melting ice onto the packed dirt floor. Lucien was 64 years old. His spine felt like a column of ground glass. His bank account was overdrawn by $3,000, and he had just traded his last usable line of credit for a horse he couldn't use. He rubbed a grease-stained hand over his jaw, feeling the harsh rasp of gray stubble. "I bought a quarter horse," Lucien muttered to the empty barn. "A 5-year-old bay gelding to cut cattle." The creature in his barn was not a quarter horse. It was a draft horse, a towering, heavy-boned behemoth, likely a mix of Belgian and Percheron, with hooves the size of cast-iron skillets and a head like an anvil. Its coat was a muddy, matted roan, scarred thick across the chest and shoulders, where heavy leather traces had rubbed the hide raw years ago. It had an ugly Roman nose and a thick winter coat that smelled of old sweat and cheap auction house disinfectant. The truck driver, a kid from the valley who clearly just wanted to beat the weather over the pass, hadn't cared. "Paperwork says lot 42, buddy. You signed for lot 42. He had a 42 slapped on his rump. I just haul him." And with that, the ramp had clattered up. The diesel engine had roared, and Lucien was left holding a frayed lead rope attached to a ton of useless, discarded logging muscle. The auction house had made a mistake. Lot 24 was the nimble little cow pony Lucien had bid on over the phone. Lot 42 was the kill pen draft horse nobody wanted, and by the time Monday rolled around and Lucien could call to sort it out, it wouldn't matter. There wouldn't be a ranch left to care about. The side door of the barn creaked open, letting in a howl of freezing wind. Clara slipped inside, putting her shoulder into the door to force it shut against the gale. She was 32, Lucien's daughter, dressed in a faded Carhartt jacket that had belonged to her late husband. Her cheeks were raw red from the wind. She stomped the snow from her boots, looked up, and stopped dead. "Dad," Clara said, her voice tight. "What is that?" "That," Lucien said, tossing the lead rope over a stall partition, "is our new cutting horse, apparently." Clara walked forward slowly. The giant horse turned its massive head, fixing a dark, liquid eye on her. It didn't spook. It didn't flinch. It just breathed, a deep, rhythmic sound like a bellows. "Did they load the wrong tag?" she asked, her voice dropping, instantly understanding the gravity of the mistake. "Lot 42 instead of 24, Lucien said, walking toward the tack room. He didn't want to look at the animal anymore. Looking at it meant looking at his own failure. Driver wouldn't take him back, said his manifest was locked. Clara stood silent for a long time. The wind rattled the corrugated tin roof of the barn. "Dad, we need a horse to push the heifers out of the basin. Dusty is dead lame, and the gray won't cross the creek in this weather." "I know. This guy can't herd cattle. He's a draft. He's too slow. He's too big. He'll bog down in the drifts." "I know, Clara," Lucien snapped, the exhaustion finally leaking into his voice. He grabbed a curry comb off a shelf and threw it back down. It clattered against a metal bucket. I know, we're broke. The tractor's alternator is shot. The bank is sending Henderson out here on Monday to appraise the equipment. And if those 50 bred heifers down in the North Draw freeze to death tonight, Henderson is taking the deed to this land. You think I don't know? Clara didn't flinch. She had inherited her mother's spine and her father's grim endurance. She walked up to the giant horse and rested a hand on its massive, scarred shoulder. The horse let out a long breath, its nostrils fluttering. He's starving, she said quietly, feeling the hard ridges of ribs beneath the matted winter coat. They haven't fed him in days. Put him in the end stall, Lucien said, walking past them toward the door. Give him half a flake of alfalfa. We can't afford to waste the good hay, but I won't let him starve on his first night here. Not his fault the world is run by idiots. Lucien pushed out into the storm, heading for the house. The temperature was plummeting faster than the radio had predicted. The sleet was turning to dry, hard snow, driven sideways by a 30-mile-an-hour wind. It was only 3 in the afternoon, but the sky was already the color of bruised iron. Inside the house, Lucien sat at the kitchen table, staring at a ledger that hadn't balanced in 3 years. The numbers were a tombstone. Since Clara's husband died, they had tried to run the 1,000-acre spread with just the two of them. They had sold off the lower pastures. They had sold the good equipment. Now, all they had was the upper ridge, 50 pregnant cows, and a winter storm that was shaping up to be a 50-year blizzard. The cows were down in the North Draw, a natural bowl that provided shelter from light wind but acted as a trap during heavy snowfall. When the snow piled high enough, the cattle would just stand there, too dumb or too terrified to move, until the snow buried them, or the cold stopped their hearts. They had to be moved to the upper barn. Tonight, the weather radio on the counter crackled. National Weather Service has upgraded the winter storm warning to a blizzard warning for the high country. Expect accumulation of 2 to 3 feet by morning, with localized drifts up to 8 feet. Wind chills plunging to 30 below zero. Lucien closed the ledger. He stood up. There was no waiting until morning. By morning, they would be ruined. By 5 o'clock, the world outside the barn was a howling white void. The wind tore through the cracks in the siding, whistling a high, atonal screech that made the saddle horses pace nervously in their stalls. Lucien's hands were completely numb, the knuckles bleeding and smeared with black grease. He threw the heavy steel wrench onto the shop floor. It hit with a dull clang. Nothing, Lucien breathed, leaning his forehead against the frozen yellow steel of the old John Deere tractor. It's dead. Clara stood holding a flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom of the machine shed. The diesel? Geld, Lucien said, stepping down from the treads. And the starter motor is shot. She just clicks. Even if I could get the block heater plugged in, we don't have 3 hours to wait. The snow is already knee-deep out there. In the draw, it'll be chest-high. We have to take the horses, Clara said. Lucien looked at her. Clara, it's a whiteout. You can't see 10 feet. If we don't drop feed for them or break a trail so they can follow us out, they die. All of them. We lose the ranch, Dad. I am not losing this ranch. Not after everything. Her voice cracked on the last word, the only sliver of vulnerability she allowed herself. Lucien swallowed hard. He knew she meant her husband. He knew she meant the years of bone-breaking labor. All right, Lucian said softly. "Saddle the gray. I'll see if Dusty can put weight on that left hoof." 10 minutes later, the reality of their desperation hit a brick wall. The gray gelding, usually a steady, reliable mount, took one look at the swirling vortex of snow outside the barn doors and planted his feet. When Lucien tried to pull him forward, the horse threw his head back, eyes rolling white with pure primal panic, and danced backward into the aisle, nearly crushing Clara against a stall door. Dusty was even worse. The older horse was limping heavily, favoring his left front leg. He wouldn't even let Clara put the bit in his mouth, tossing his head and shivering violently. Animals knew. They felt the barometric pressure dropping in their bones. They knew that stepping out into that black, freezing maelstrom was a death sentence. "They won't go," Clara said, leaning against the wooden planks, chest heaving, the lead rope dangling limply from her hand. "We can't force them. Even if we get them out there, they'll flounder in the deep drifts. They don't have the weight." Lucien looked at the open barn door, watching the snow pile up in the threshold. He felt a deep, hollow silence settle into his chest. It was the feeling of a fight ending. He was tired. He was so incredibly tired. Then a sound broke the silence. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Lucien turned his head. In the back stall, the giant draft horse was rhythmically chewing his meager ration of alfalfa. He was ignoring the howling wind. He was ignoring the panicked pacing of the saddle horses. He just stood there, shifting his massive weight from one foot to the other, a mountain of bone and muscle wrapped in a scarred winter coat. Lucien walked slowly down the aisle, stopping in front of the stall. The giant stopped chewing. He lowered his enormous head over the top rung of the wooden gate, sniffing Lucien's jacket. His breath was warm and smelled of sweet grass. Up close, the scars across his chest were thick, ropey cords of silver hair against the dark roan. This animal hadn't been a pet. He had been a machine. He had pulled timber out of muddy forests. He had dragged plows through unyielding earth. He knew what work was. He knew what suffering was. Lucien looked at the sheer size of the horse's chest, the thick, tree-trunk legs. "Clara," Lucien said, never taking his eyes off the giant. "Yeah?" "Go to the back of the tack room, under the old tarps. Find your grandfather's logging harness." Clara walked up behind him. "Dad, no, he doesn't know us. We don't know him. Draft horses need to be driven, not ridden. You can't just slap a saddle on a beast like that." "I'm not going to saddle him," Lucien said, unlatching the stall door. "I'm going to hitch him." "To what? We don't have a wagon that can roll in this snow." "To the flatbed sled," Lucien said, turning to her. A strange, desperate energy was beginning to burn in his chest. "We load it with 6 square bales of hay. We hitch him up. If he can break a trail through the snow down into the draw, the cows will follow the sled back up for the hay." Clara stared at him. "That sled weighs 400 pounds empty, with the hay and dragging through wet, deep snow. That's over a ton of drag. It's a 2-horse job." "Look at him, Clara," Lucien said. The giant horse had stepped out of the stall. He didn't bolt. He didn't pace. He stood in the aisle, dwarfing the 2 humans, solid as a brick wall. 20 minutes later, they were dragging the heavy leather logging harness out of the dust. It was stiff, freezing, and heavy as lead. The brass buckles were green with tarnish. It took both of them to lift the heavy collar over the horse's head. The giant simply lowered his neck accepting the weight of the iron and leather as if he had worn it every day of his life. When Lucien tightened the belly band, the horse didn't flinch. They led him out into the freezing wind to the side of the barn where the old wooden sled sat buried under a fresh drift. The cold hit Lucien like a physical blow, stealing the breath from his lungs. He struggled with the frozen chains, his bare fingers sticking to the iron as he hooked the traces to the sled's singletree. "All right," Lucien yelled over the screaming wind, pulling his wool collar up over his mouth. He took the heavy driving reins in his hands. He didn't have a whip. He wouldn't use one anyway. He looked at the horse's massive back. "Come on, big man," Lucien said. "Let's see what you're made of. Walk on." He slapped the reins gently against the horse's rump. For a second, nothing happened. The sled runners were frozen tight to the ground. Then, the giant leaned forward. He didn't lunge. He simply dug his massive dinner plate hooves into the ice, lowered his head, and put his weight into the leather collar. The muscles in his hindquarters bunched, rising like boulders under his scarred coat. There was a sharp crack like a rifle shot as the sled runners broke free from the ice. The sled jerked forward. Lucien stumbled backward, barely keeping his grip on the reins. The giant horse didn't hesitate. He stepped out into the black, howling blizzard, hitting a waist-high snowdrift at the edge of the yard. The snow parted around his massive chest like water around the prow of a battleship. He didn't slow down. He just kept walking, steady, unstoppable, dragging the heavy sled into the storm. Clara stood in the doorway of the barn, watching them disappear into the whiteout. Lucien leaned into the wind, his boots following in the deep, massive trenches the horse's hooves left behind. They were heading down into the draw. They were walking into hell. And for the first time in years, Lucien thought they might just win. The trench behind the sled was the only navigable path left in the world. The old man walked in it, his boots finding the compacted ice left by the giant's massive hooves. The wind was a physical weight, a solid wall of moving air that pressed against his chest and tried to push him back up the mountain. Ahead of him, the horse was a dark, moving monolith in the whiteout. The animal didn't falter. He moved with a brutal, rhythmic efficiency. Thump, drag, thump, drag. He was a creature bred over generations to pull timber out of frozen mud, and this snow, while deep, lacked the heavy suction of spring clay. To the draft horse, it was just another day in the traces. His head stayed low. His massive shoulders rolled under the leather collar. The heavy iron singletree groaned, but the sled kept moving. They hit the tree line an hour later. The wind dropped slightly as the ancient pines blocked the worst of the gale, but the snow was deeper here. It had drifted into the natural bowl of the North Draw, piling up in waist-high ridges. The old man stumbled, his knees going weak. His lungs burned with every breath of the sub-zero air. Ice coated his eyelashes, freezing his eyes shut if he blinked for too long. He grabbed the rough wood of the sled's tailgate to steady himself. "Whoa!" he rasped. His throat was too dry, the sound swallowed instantly by the storm. He yanked on the driving lines. The giant stopped immediately. He stood in the chest-deep snow, his sides heaving, blowing twin plumes of steam from his nostrils that whipped away in the wind. They had reached the bottom of the draw. The old man wiped the ice from his face and unclipped his heavy flashlight, panning the beam through the swirling snow. He found them huddled against a rocky overhang, 50 black and red shapes tightly packed together entirely covered in a thick layer of white. They looked like fresh snowdrifts. They were entirely silent. A hard knot formed in the old man's gut. Silence was a death knell. Cattle that were fighting to live would bawl. Cattle that had given up just stood still and waited for the freeze to take them. 3 of the heifers were already lying down. A cow that lies down in a blizzard doesn't get up again. He didn't have time to mourn. He waded past the sled, the snow dragging at his thighs like wet cement, and pulled a heavy hunting knife from his belt. He slashed the frozen twine on the first bale of alfalfa. The tension snapped, and the bale expanded. The old man kicked the thick green flakes off the side of the sled into the trampled snow. He moved to the next bale, slashing, kicking, spreading the feed. The sharp, sweet smell of summer grass cut through the sterile scent of ozone and ice. One of the standing cows, a scarred black baldy, lifted her head. She sniffed the air. A low, rumbling moo vibrated in her chest. She pushed away from the herd, her legs stiff and mechanical, and floundered through the snow toward the green flakes. She buried her nose in the hay and began to chew frantically. The sight of her moving sparked a chain reaction. The others shifted. First one, then 3, then a dozen. They began to drag themselves out of their icy huddle, lured by the calories, moving toward the sled. The old man waded toward the 3 cows that were lying down. He kicked the snow away from the closest one, slapping her frozen flank hard. "Get up!" he yelled, his voice cracking. "Move! Get up!" she groaned, throwing her head sideways, and rocked onto her front knees. With a desperate heave, she found her footing, shaking the heavy snow from her back, and shambled toward the feed. The other 2 followed suit, driven by the herd instinct. They were all up. But they were still miles from the barn, and they were weak. The old man turned to the giant. The horse was watching him, ears swiveled back, waiting for the command. "All right, big man," the old man wheezed, grabbing the frozen reins. "We gotta turn this rig around. You gotta break the trail back. They'll follow the trench." Turning a flatbed sled in deep snow is not a maneuver of grace. It requires brute force to drag the iron runners sideways through the resistance. The old man clicked his tongue, slapping the leather against the horse's heavy rump. "Haw! Come haw!" The giant leaned into the left trace. He threw his massive head, digging his front hooves into the hidden bedrock beneath the snow. The leather harness groaned. The muscles in his hindquarters bunched into tight, rock-hard knots. The sled scraped, resisted, and then yielded, sliding heavily through the drift until it faced back up the mountain. The old man climbed onto the back of the sled, standing on the remaining 3 bales of hay. He couldn't walk back up. His legs were finished. If he fell in the snow now, he wouldn't get up. "Walk on," he commanded. The giant lowered his head and hit the collar. The journey back to life began. The climb out of the draw was hell. The wind had shifted, blowing directly down the mountain, hitting them straight in the face. The snow was falling so heavily, it felt like trying to breathe underwater. The trench they had cut on the way down was already half filled with fresh drifts. The horse wasn't just pulling the sled now, he was plowing a fresh path uphill against gravity and the storm. Behind them, the herd of 50 heifers strung out in a long, miserable line, walking in the deep channel the sled left behind. Every 50 yards, the old man kicked a flake of alfalfa off the back of the sled. The cows kept moving to reach the next bite. The trail of food was the only thing keeping them from stopping and freezing to death on the ridge. An hour passed. Then 2. The world shrank to nothing but the rear end of the draft horse, the creak of frozen leather, and the biting, agonizing cold. The old man couldn't feel his feet anymore. His hands were locked claws around the driving lines. Then the sled stopped. The old man jolted forward as the runners hit something hard and unyielding. The giant kept walking for a half second before the traces snapped taut, yanking him backward. The horse scrambled, his steel shoes sparking against buried stone, and came to a halt, sides heaving like a bellows. The old man climbed clumsily off the sled, sinking to his waist in a massive drift. He waded to the front, an old deadfall. A massive, rotting pine trunk had been hidden beneath the snow. The heavy iron runner of the sled had driven straight into a deep notch in the wood, wedging itself tight. The old man fell to his knees in the snow, tearing at the ice with his numb, bleeding hands, trying to clear the runner. It was useless. The wood was frozen solid. He tried to pull the sled backward to unwedge it, but it weighed hundreds of pounds. He couldn't budge it an inch. He looked back. The lead cow had stopped. The line of cattle behind her was bumping into each other, freezing up. If they stopped moving here, on the exposed ridge, the wind chill would kill them in 20 minutes. Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced the old man's exhaustion. They had made it so far. To lose them now, less than a mile from the barn, was a cruelty he couldn't stomach. He grabbed the reins, wading up beside the giant's massive head. "Come on," the old man begged, his voice breaking. "Please, pull." He slapped the reins on the horse's back. The giant hit the collar, hard. The sled groaned, the wood of the deadfall creaking, but the runner stayed wedged. The horse stopped, blowing hard. "Again!" the old man screamed into the wind. "Get up!" The giant didn't just lean this time. He threw his entire 2,000 pounds of body weight forward. His front hooves pawed violently at the ice, searching for a grip. He dropped his chest practically to the snow, his belly scraping the drifts, finding traction where there was none. The heavy leather harness screamed under the tension. The old man watched in awe and terror as the thick leather traces stretched. The horse let out a sound. Not a whinny, but a deep, guttural roar of absolute exertion. Crack! The sound echoed over the howling wind like a gunshot. The rotting pine trunk exploded into splinters. The sled violently lurched forward, rolling right over the shattered wood. The giant stumbled to his knees, his nose hitting the snow, but he didn't stop. He scrambled upward, driving his hind legs beneath him, righting himself without missing a beat, and kept pulling. The old man grabbed the side of the sled as it went past, dragging his freezing body onto the wooden boards. He lay flat on his back, staring up at the black sky, feeling the steady, rhythmic thump, drag of the unstoppable machine pulling him home. The sky began to turn a pale bruised purple. Dawn. They crested the final ridge. The wind suddenly died, blocked by the silhouette of the upper barn. The large sliding doors were wide open. A harsh yellow halogen light spilled out onto the snow, cutting through the gloom. His daughter was standing in the center of the light. She was holding a pitchfork, her face pale and drawn. When she saw the giant emerge from the blizzard, steaming in the cold air, dragging the sled, she dropped the pitchfork. It clattered against the frozen dirt. The old man didn't say a word. He didn't have the breath. He guided the horse straight into the barn, into the warmth and the light, and let the reins drop from his dead hands. Outside, the first of the black baldies crested the hill, saw the open barn doors, and broke into a stiff trot. The rest of the herd followed, streaming into the dry, windless sanctuary, their coats caked in ice, but alive, every single one of them. The old man rolled off the sled. His legs gave out, and he hit the dirt floor hard. His daughter was there instantly, pulling him up by his jacket, her hands frantically checking his face for frostbite. "You're back," she kept whispering. "You're back." "The herd," he croaked out. "They're in. They're all in." The old man turned his head. The giant horse was standing in the center aisle, exactly where he had been yesterday afternoon. He looked terrible. His thick coat was completely matted with ice and sweat. Blood trickled from his nose, and his chest heaved with exhaustion, but he was standing. The daughter walked over to him. She didn't hesitate. She threw her arms around his massive, scarred neck, burying her face in the wet, freezing mane, and she wept. The horse let out a long, heavy breath, resting his heavy anvil of a head against her shoulder. When the bank appraiser showed up on Monday morning, the storm had broken, leaving the world buried in brilliant, blinding white. He expected to find a ruined farm and frozen livestock. Instead, he found 50 healthy heifers eating prime hay in the upper barn. He also found the old man sitting on an overturned bucket, carefully brushing out the winter coat of a draft horse that was easily the ugliest, largest animal the appraiser had ever seen. "That your cutting horse?" the appraiser asked, looking at the sheer size of the beast. The old man paused, the curry comb resting against a thick silver scar on the horse's shoulder. He looked at the giant. The giant blinked a dark, liquid eye back at him. "No," the old man said softly. "He's family. If this story of grit, survival, and finding worth in the forgotten hit you where it counts, don't leave just yet. Hit that like button to show some love for Lot 42. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder to never give up, and subscribe to the channel for more deeply human stories. Drop a comment below. What would you have named this giant hero?